During the Middle Ages, people were punished in many different ways that today would appear cruel and unusual. Medieval times were no less than hell for those convicted of crimes. Criminals were brutally tortured with some of the worst punishments ever known. Some of the most severe punishments were being burned at the stake, drawn and quartered, and boiled alive. These punishments were often reserved for the most serious crimes, such as treason or heresy. Even small violations may result in severe punishments, such as flogging or jail. Many of these punishments were intended to be as severe and public as possible in order to prevent others from committing the same crimes. Most people are aware that torture was once thought of as a regular method of enforcing punishment. It was also one of the most effective methods for getting information from criminals that only an insider would have known. Law enforcement did not prohibit these horrific punishments, and laws and local customs imposed no restrictions on how prisoners should be treated or the amount to which they may be tortured. Higher levels of torture were preferred since the criminals' confessions were deemed suspicious if they had not suffered significantly more. However, the type of torture used varied from a person to person, depending on the victim's crimes, gender, and class in society. A common element among professional torturers were the use of various methods, instruments, and tools to instill suffering in their victims while prolonging their lives, as prolonged death is a sort of torture in itself. Iron chair of spikes. The chair was lined with hundreds of sharp spikes that covered the back, seat, armrests, leg rests, and footrests. The amount of spikes in a chair would be 500 to 1,500. Some chairs featured spikes on the headrest, and the torturer would push the victim's head into them. A victim would be seated in the chair, their wrists tied by straps or two bars that pushed their arms against the armrests. Some versions of the chair had holes in the seat, allowing the torturer to start a fire beneath it and slowly cook the victim alive. It was often used as psychological torture. The victim would be tied to a chair and forced to watch someone being tortured in it, knowing that if they didn't confess, they were next. Catherine the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, sometimes known as the Catherine wheel, was used for torturing and murder criminals during public executions. The executioner would use a large hammer or iron rod to break the victim's bones, usually beginning with the limbs. The victim would be struck several times until their bones were fractured. In some cases, instead of breaking the victim's bones, the wheel was rolled over them, crushing their bones and causing serious internal damage. The breaking of bones was often accompanied by severe bruising, internal injuries, and organ damage, leading to a slow and agonizing death. Following the execution, the victim's body may be left on the wheel, either for public view or as a warning to others. The wheel, still linked to the victim's body, was sometimes shown in public on a pole or scaffold. The stake. Being burnt at the stake was usually the last step to torture victims, as this type of torture was always fatal. Conceptually, it's a relatively easy process. Make a pile of dry wood with a stake in the center to tie the victim to, then light it. The fire does all of the job. It normally took approximately 30 minutes for the victim to lose consciousness, but if it was windy and the fire was blowing away from him or her, he or she may be slowly roasted to death for up to 2 hours. Because the victims had previously been tortured with the rack or another means, the suffering must have been unbearable. Because the victims had previously been tortured with the rack or another means, the suffering must have been unbearable. Despite the misery of being burned at the stake, the Inquisition's torturers in the Netherlands developed a particularly painful twist. Before being bound to the stake, the victim's tongue was placed between two hot iron plates. The burnt and swollen tongue would only allow weird, muffled screams of pain once the searing began, which allegedly added a lot to the audience's pleasure. The pillory. A pillory consisted of two parallel wooden boards linked together with holes for the neck and wrists. When the doors opened, the victim inserted his or her head and arms through the openings. The pillory was then closed, making it impossible for the victim to escape. The pillory itself caused little injury to the victim, although it was undoubtedly uncomfortable. The complete equipment was frequently placed on a stage in public. The goal was to humiliate and embarrass the victim for his or her actions. The crowd of people would throw things at the victim, including rotten vegetables, dead animals, and feces. Stones and other blunt items were also thrown, potentially causing terrible injuries or even death. Pair of anguish. The pair of anguish was a device used in the Middle Ages to torture women accused of causing unsuccessful childbirths. This device was also used to punish liars, blasphemers, and homosexuals. The device was placed into the victim's orifices, such as the anus in homosexuals, the vagina in women, and the mouth in those who lied and committed blasphemy. The aim of the pair of anguish was to enter it into the victim's mouth, vagina, or anus, and then open it. The device was said to inflict terrible discomfort and tears, which could only be relieved by screwing the lobes back down. Torture by rats. A popular practice used by medieval torturers was to put starved rats into the victims' bodies, usually through the intestines. Because no one would allow this happen in their consciousness, prisoners were bound to the ground or any horizontal surface. A rat was confined inside a metal container and then placed on the victim's tummy. The metal container was then progressively heated. The rat was forced to seek an escape route as the temperature inside the container rose. The only possible way out was through the victim's stomach. This caused an agonizing and gruesome death as the rat dug through the victim's stomach for hours. Breast ripper. A breast ripper is considered one of the most brutal tools used to torture prisoners. This tool, sometimes known as the iron spider, was mostly used against women suspected of adultery, heresy, self-induced abortion, blasphemy, and witchcraft. The tool was also used to conduct interrogations. The breast ripper was frequently heated during the torture and included 4 claws that slowly and cruelly ripped off the victim's breasts. This weapon was only linked to the woman's single breast. If she survived the pain, the experience would leave her scarred forever. Knee splitter. The knee splitter was a common tool during the Inquisition. This tool consisted of 2 spiky wood blocks positioned in front of and behind the knee. These blocks were joined by 2 huge screws, which were gradually fastened closer together, crushing the knee between the blocks. The number of spikes varied according to the nature of the crime that the prisoner had committed. It also depends on the prisoner's status. However, it is safe to assume that this tool would leave the knee essentially useless. Brazen bull. The brazen bull, also known as the Sicilian bull, was a device used for execution. The bull was made entirely of bronze and was hollow on the interior, having an entrance on one side of the bull. The criminals were compelled to enter the bronze bull through the side door. Once they were completely inside, they were sealed in from the outside. A fire was lit beneath the bull, and as the fire heated the metal, the victim was gradually roasted alive. The guy will eventually die inside the brazen bull from serious burns. The Judas cradle. The Judas cradle, sometimes known as the Judas chair, was an Italian creation designed to inflict suffering on the victim. The prisoner was lowered to a pyramid-shaped seat using ropes. As the victim was lowered, the pyramid's point entered the victim's vagina or anus. This device causes agony by applying severe pressure and stretching to the orifices, which might eventually cause irreparable damage. So here were 10 of the most brutal torture devices and punishments used in the Middle Ages. Which one do you think is the most brutal out of them all? Do let me know in the comments. Also do subscribe to my channel Medieval Mind for more videos about Middle Ages like this.